What is the little season of Satan, and are we in it? We'll talk about that on this special episode of Faith by Reason. Welcome to Faith by Reason. The website behind it all is faithbyreason.net. There you will find hundreds of hours of study material, blogs, podcasts, and video. And again, this is a special episode of Faith by Reason. You can tell because you are able to see my lovely face at this point. It's something I'll be doing going forward. And so what I want to do in this episode is talk a little bit about what's going on with Faith by Reason and then get into our subject matter for today. So with Faith by Reason, there are a few things that I'm going to start doing to get some more content out. Number one is I am working on the Genesis series. I know that many of you have been asking about it. I've promised it since the midpoint of the Revelation series that I will be going on to the book of Genesis, which is an amazing, fascinating book, and I am working on it. I promise. I'm doing a ton of research on it. Genesis is very intense. In some ways, it's even more intense and more research intensive than Revelation for its own reasons, which we'll see when we get there. But I'm working on it now, and I didn't want you to think that I forgot about it, but I'm still working on it. In the meantime, I do want to have some other content available for you, and there's a few ways we're getting some of that content out. Right now, I'm doing a regular series on Fridays, a live stream with the guys from the Nephilim Death Squad. Great guys. So shout out to the Raven and to Top Lobster. You guys are awesome. Thank you for having me on your show. Thank you for allowing me to present my end times information. So I do that live with those guys every week, and I'm going to start putting those live streams, making those available on my YouTube channel. I just need to get the right technical information happening. I'm a bit of a Luddite when it comes to some of these things, but Top Lobster, he's great with that. He's going to help me, and we're going to get that information out to you and get those episodes out to you. I'll start linking some of that stuff on faithbyreason.net and on my YouTube channel, so that'll be a regular feature. And also, I'm going to start doing some short form videos, a minute or two for reels. So there'll be some short YouTube reels for Faith by Reason where I'll be giving you just some short snippets of Christian philosophy, and also some reaction videos reacting to some of the insane things that are going on right now as they deal with the Bible, with Christian philosophy, with end times, because there's a lot of things happening right now, and I want to start putting that information out there on a regular basis. And it's, again, very short, minute or two. And what it'll do is it'll just provide more content for you. It'll also raise the algorithms for Faith by Reason and kind of and get us out there more and get my information out there more, because the more content you have, the higher you rank on YouTube and Rumble and TikTok and Instagram and all those other things. So I'm going to be getting that kind of stuff out there. Okay, those are my plans. You can look forward to seeing some of that stuff soon. So enough self-promotion. Let's get into what we want to talk about in this episode, and that is the so-called little season, and the idea of whether or not we're actually in the little season. So when I first heard about this whole theory, doctrine, oh, it's more of a theory than a doctrine, on it's an eschatological theory about where we are currently on the prophetic timetable. And there are many people who believe that we are in this little season. Now, when I first heard about it, I was skeptical. I kind of dismissed it. It just seemed like another just weird, let's just call it a aberrant theory about the end times. And there are tons of those happening right now. We seem to be in end times fever for whatever reason. I think, well, the reason is I think because we're getting close to it. And I thought that personally, I was seeing all this stuff because of my perspective. I mean, I'm really into eschatology. Obviously, I've done a 60 episode series on Revelation, which hopefully you've already seen. And I thought that maybe my perspective is skewed and maybe things aren't accelerating the way I thought they were. But recently, I was back down in my hometown visiting my family, and I talked to some friends, some guys I hadn't seen in many years. We were hanging out, and I asked them, I said, "Hey guys, have you noticed things seem to be accelerating? Things seem to be going faster and faster as we get through this period in our history?" And to a man, they all said, "Yeah, things are just exploding. Things are happening exponentially fast." So I knew it wasn't just me. I think this end times mania, and there's always been an obsession with the end times for as long as we can remember, because every generation has felt that they were the last generation or the terminal generation, all the way back to the first century. But things are really exploding and they're happening so fast. There are just fewer gaps between these big events. An attempted assassination on a presidential candidate, a literal coup in another major political party to bring in another candidate. We have wars happening on the verge of World War III. And there are the gaps between these big events happening are less and less. It's almost like birth pangs. For those of you who have given birth or have been in the room with someone who's given birth, your spouse, hopefully, you notice that as you get closer to the birth of the child, the contractions happen with less and less intervals between them, and so it's just like what Jesus said, birth pangs. So because of that, you're seeing a lot more end time information out there on podcasts and YouTube and Rumble and whatever other social media you're listening to. There's tons of them out there. And there are lots of theories out there, a lot of teaching out there. Some of it's good. There is some good teaching out there by some really good Bible teachers. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of bad teaching out there as well that you have to be careful of and use your discernment with. And I would say I think it's honestly 60-40 between 40% good teaching, 60% or more bad teaching. And you need to be aware of it. You need to have discernment. Everyone seems to be thinking that they have the latest, greatest theory on what's going on in the end times. You turn on your YouTube channel, and depending what your algorithm is like, you may see a bunch of people saying, "Oh, I've had these dreams." Tons of prophetic people allegedly having prophetic dreams out there. Oh, I had this dream that Jesus came back and he's coming back on August 31st, or and the financial crisis is going to happen in October, or all these things. Everyone seems to be having these crazy prophetic dreams. Now, I'm not against the idea of people having prophetic dreams. The Bible says people will, but not every single person, not every single human being on the planet is having a prophetic dream. And you have to use discernment. If someone says, "Oh, I saw a vision of Jesus and he was tall and skinny with beautiful blonde hair and piercing blue eyes," no, that's not Jesus. Jesus didn't have a goatee. He didn't have long blonde hair. He didn't have blue eyes. That's Cesare Borgia, which you can look that up on my series on the real Jesus. When unfortunately, the medieval Jesus paintings were based on Cesare Borgia, who was a degenerate rapist, incestuous murderer. Who again, I'm not going to get into that. That's a rabbit trail I don't want to go down. But that's just a sign that these aren't prophetic dreams. These are just dreams you're having. Just because you have a dream doesn't mean it's prophetic. Maybe you just had too much spicy food last night. So again, what I'm saying is that have discernment. But the point is that there are tons of prophetic teachings out there. A bunch of people just putting their thoughts on YouTube, and some of it much of it may or may not be good teaching. So when I first saw this whole little season idea, the theory behind it, my first thought was to dismiss it. It just seemed like another one of those aberrant theories. However, I started seeing a whole lot of people really getting into it and really asking questions and promoting it, not just on just various YouTube channels, but I've seen it on uh, podcasts of people who I know and respect asking about the little season and are we really in it. I've seen it in mainstream news, people who have millions and millions of followers talking about this so-called little season. And I've been getting personally questions from you, the listeners and watchers of Faith by Reason, asking, "Are we in this little season? What is it? What should we do about it?" So I thought it would behoove me to actually look into it more, not dismiss it, look into it, do some research, and see if this is what's really happening. So I did. I dived in, I did some research, and I have to say that after doing all my research, initially, my first thought with the little season was that this is bad theology. However, after looking into it more closely, doing more research into it, diving into the people who are promoting it and seeing what they're all about, I have to say now that it's not just a bad theory. It is a horrible, terrible, ludicrous, utterly asinine theory. It is illogical. It is not biblical. It is anti-historical. It is just a bad theory. And most of all, it's dangerous. It's really dangerous. So that's why I wanted to make this video to really address all those questions at once. So let's begin by just talking about what the little season is. Let me give you what what it is, and then we'll go from there. So, the idea of the little season is that we are currently, contemporarily, in this season, this period of time between the end of the millennium. So, we're in a post-millennial period between the end of the millennium and the Great White Throne Judgment, which is the last um, uh, uh, aspect of evil being judged. And then after the Great White Throne Judgment, then heaven and earth passes away, and we are in eternity at the New Jerusalem or the lake of fire, depending on what you believe or didn't believe when you were on this earth. So let's back all the way up and look at what this little season states. It basically states that the millennial reign of Christ already happened, which of course means that Armageddon and the tribulation already happened because those things precede the millennial reign of Christ in the second coming. And of course, and the rapture already happened. So according to this little season theory, at some point in the past, over 1,000 years ago, at least 1,150 years ago, and I'll explain to you how I got to that additional 150 years on top of the 1,000 years. But at least over 1,000 years ago, the tribulation happened. So I guess you have to say it'd be at least 1,157 years ago, because the 7 year tribulation period happens before the millennial reign of Christ. So at some point, 1,000+ years ago, the rapture occurred. And if you have questions about the rapture, go to the rapture series. Go to the right navigation area on faithbyreason.net. Click on that. I'll do a whole series on the rapture and my thoughts about that. I'm not getting into that here. It's too much information for right now. Or you can go to YouTube and look at the Revelation, the Rapture series there. Raptures happened. The 7 year tribulation happens. All that devastation has already occurred. The Battle of Armageddon, or the Armageddon scenario, because it's not much of a battle. Jesus just speaks words and all of his enemies are destroyed. The Armageddon scenario has happened. The second coming of Jesus has already occurred 1,000+ years ago. And then at the second coming of Christ, the beast, the Antichrist, and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. They're done. And then Satan, or the dragon, the Nachash, or serpent from the Garden of Eden, our great enemy, he doesn't go to the lake of fire. He is bound for 1,000 years and thrown into the abyss, the bottomless pit, the abuso. He's basically put in the penalty box for 1,000 years. And why is he put there? It says clearly in the Bible, he is put there so that he can deceive the nations no longer for 1,000 years. And yes, the millennium is a literal 1,000 years. It says so 6 times in Revelation chapter 20. I do a whole series on the millennium. Go to that for your reference. And so he's put away for 1,000 years, and during that 1,000 years, Jesus rules and reigns over the earth along with the saints, those who were raptured or who died in Christ. They all come back to life, get their resurrection bodies, and they co-rule and reign with Jesus for 1,000 years. And during this 1,000 years, it's a time of perfect prosperity and peace and justice. However, if you are not on Jesus's side, you will hate it. We talk about this in the Millennial series, because Jesus will be ruling with a rod of iron. That rod of iron is not a walking stick. It's a stick of punishment. That rod of iron is what Jesus uses to execute justice. And keep in mind, this is what people say they want. People have said for time immemorial that they want perfect justice. What are the objections you hear about when people say they don't believe in God? They say, well, if there was really a God, why is there evil in the world? Why doesn't God stop evil? Why doesn't he punish evil before it happens or as soon as it happens? Well, he will. During the millennium, Jesus will punish evil immediately, and people will hate it. Why? Because when people say, why doesn't Jesus or God punish evil? What they really are saying is, why doesn't God punish the big evils that other people do? But they ignore the little evils that they do. Well, Jesus will be perfectly just in his rules. That means he will not only punish the big evils that other people do, he'll punish your little evils. He'll punish gossiping and lying and cheating and lust and all those things. And people will hate it. They will absolutely despise it, but there's nothing they can do because Jesus rules perfectly. But then after the 1,000 years, the Bible says that after the 1,000 years, Satan, the dragon, will be released for a short period of time, or in your King James Version, he'll be released for a little season. And when he's released for that little season, he will have one job and one job only. He will be released in order to gather the nations of the world who are not on Jesus' side. He will gather them together to surround Jerusalem. Why? Because Jesus will be reigning from Jerusalem during the millennium. So that he will gather all the nations of the world. He will deceive them, bring them to Jerusalem to overthrow the rule of Jesus. And then it says in Revelation chapter 20 that fire will come down from heaven, devour them all, and that'll be it. No more rebellions. Great white throne of judgment. Everyone is judged according to their works. Then we go into eternity. So according to the little season theory, that's where we are now. We're in that little season where Satan is supposed to be gathering the nations together to surround Israel and overthrow the reign of Jesus. Okay, so as you know from watching and listening to Faith by Reason, that's not my personal theology. I am what people call a futurist, meaning that I don't believe these things have already happened. I believe that they are still in the future. I don't believe the rapture has happened. I don't believe that the tribulation has happened. I certainly don't believe that the second coming, Armageddon, and the millennium have happened. But again, there are lots of people who are buying into this idea that all those things have happened already, and we are currently in that little season of Satan. So even though I disagree with it, I try to be contrastive. That is the goal of Faith by Reason. It's contrastive thinking. That's where the whole jelly beans thing comes in. You can look on Faith by Reason for more information on that. So what does it mean to be contrastive? It means being contrastive means trying to prove your opponent right, not proving yourself right. That's comparative thinking. Comparative thinking is when we try to prove ourselves right. That's what we do when we argue most of the time. We're arguing our own points. We're trying to prove ourselves right. But contrastive thinking takes humility. You have to be humble in order to try to prove your opponent right. So let's look at this contrastively, which is what I tried to do. I want to try to prove the little season right and see where it goes. So let's see, what would things look like if the little season was correct, if we were truly in a post-millennial period and Satan's gathering people against Jerusalem. First of all, you have to conclude that, again, the rapture and tribulation have already happened. So at some point, 1,000+ years ago, at least 1,157 years ago, the rapture happened. People were caught up, millions or thousands, I don't know how many people were around 1,000+ years ago who were Christian, but whoever, a few thousand people at least disappeared. No one noted that in history. There is no history from 1,000+ years ago that a bunch of people disappeared without a trace. Well, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. I mean, history it's been over 1,000 years. Maybe that history was obfuscated. All right, it's fine. That's possible. Not plausible, but possible. But then you have the tribulation, 7 years of the most incredible, horrible devastation that the world has ever seen. In the Old Testament, it talks a ton about what the tribulation, the day of the Lord, the time of Jacob's trouble is going to be like, and it's devastating. Jesus himself said there has never been a period like it in the history of the world, nor will there ever be. That means that this period is more devastating than the flood, than any of the judgments of the Old Testament. This is going to be worse than that. But there's no evidence that we see of it. I mean, let's just look. You've seen my Revelation series. You know all the things that have happened to the earth, that will happen to the earth during the tribulation. But let's just look at a couple of things that are going to happen towards the end, that will happen right before Armageddon and the second coming, which apparently has already happened. All the water in the world is turned to blood. Fresh water and salt water all turn to blood. In the case of fresh water, it's the blood of a dead man, which is thick and gooey and nasty and stinks. Where there's no evidence that ever happened, no historical records of it happening, and certainly no physical records of it. No, so how could that be true? Well, I suppose Jesus could have cleaned it all up. I mean, Jesus is all powerful, God is all powerful. I guess so they could have cleaned it up. And to be fair, I truly believe, even with my futurist point of view, that at the beginning of the millennium, they will have to clean all that blood up because we need water. Human beings are going to live for 1,000 years, and human beings can't live for more than a few days without potable water. So it'll be cleaned up. So, okay, fine, I'll give you that. However, also at the end of the tribulation, because we have the six seals, which are devastating. We have the seven seals, which are devastating. We have the seven trumpet judgments, which are devastating. But let's just focus on the seven bowls of wrath, which are the last thing that happens from God's judgment wise before Armageddon and the second coming. The last bowl, the seventh bowl of wrath, there's this great earthquake that's unlike any earthquake that's ever existed. It will, and it says vividly, clearly in Revelation chapter 16, that every mountain will disappear and every island will be flat away. No, there'll be no more islands and no more mountains. That's some serious tectonic activity, serious tectonic plate movement that will crumble all the mountains of the world and cause all the islands to disappear. And islands are basically mountains that are partially below water and partially above water. That's the part above water are the islands that we're on. All islands are gone, all mountains are gone. That supposedly happened 1,000+ years ago. Here's the problem. There are still mountains. I can look out my window right now. I'm in an area where there is a major mountain range near me. I'm looking out my window right now. I see the mountain. How are there mountains now? If all the mountains went away 1,000 years ago, why are there still mountains? Islands, there's still islands. I've visited many islands in my lifetime. Just a few months ago, my family and I were in Hawaii. We were in the Hawaiian Islands. Those are all islands. They're still there. I've been to the Caribbean islands. They're still there. So if all the mountains and islands disappeared at the end of the tribulation 1,000 years ago, why are there still islands? Why are there still mountains? Well, I suppose you could say that Jesus called them to come back. I guess that's theoretically possible. But not only do they come back, they have to come back exactly the way they were before. Folks, there are maps, there are ancient maps of the world, of regional areas that precede the physical incarnation of Jesus in the first century. Mount Olympus in Greece, Mount Kilimanjaro, there are maps of that. All the mountains in Israel, Mount Hermon, all the different islands in the Aegean Sea, Crete and Cyprus in the Mediterranean. All of those islands and mountains, there are already maps of them. So apparently, not only did Jesus raise mountains and islands back up, he put them in the exact same place with the exact same topography that they had before. Folks, that doesn't make any sense. That's just stupid. That's ridiculous. That is asinine. That stretches credulity beyond what any reasonable person or even any unreasonable person could possibly think. That all the mountains and islands would disappear, and then Jesus brings them back exactly the way they were before, according to ancient maps. Come on. Really? No. Oh, but there's more. Just wait. There were all, in addition to the topographical and geological changes, there also in the millennium. Well, let's go back before the millennium. Jesus returned apparently after the tribulation, after all these devastation, which apparently again, there's no evidence that any of this devastation happened. But then Jesus returns, perhaps the greatest event in all of human history. Why is there no record of it? Why no one decided to jot down, hey, Jesus returned today, and here's what he did? Nothing. Not a single historic book talks about the return of Jesus 1,000+ years ago. Nothing. Not a word, not a syllable, nothing in a writing or on a stone tablet or anything recording Jesus returning to earth. Huh. Okay, let's keep going. Jesus returns and he reigns for 1,000 years. In addition to the geographical changes, there are also some really major biological changes in the millennium. The book of Isaiah, which along with the book of Ezekiel, gives vivid descriptions of what's going on during the millennium. One of them is longevity for human beings increases. The book of Isaiah says that if someone during the millennium dies at 100 years old, they're considered a child at 100 years old, meaning that human lifespan is going to greatly increase. It's going to be similar to what it was during the antediluvian or pre-flood period, where people lived for hundreds of years, 600, 700, 800 years regularly in the antediluvian period. No one's living that long right now. I don't know anyone who's 200, 300, 400 years old. Do you? No, you don't. No one does. My oldest living relative is my aunt, who is 92 years old. Now, she's as healthy as you could expect for a 92-year-old, but she's 92. She's at the end of her life. She's not going to live very much longer. Myself, I'm middle-aged. I am halfway through my life, probably more than halfway through. I am at the rate my body's deteriorating. I'm not going to live to be 100, let alone 3, 4, 5, 600 years old. So, what happened there? Why are we no longer living hundreds of years? Did Jesus just turn off the spigot for our longevity when he left? Which, by the way, he would have had to leave, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But okay, no evidence of that, none whatsoever. Also, there were changes with other biological life. The animal kingdom. The book of Isaiah states that during the millennium, the wolf and the lamb will lie down together, and that the children will play on the holes of poisonous snakes, and the lion will eat straw like an ox. So apparently, carnivorous animals will become herbivores. Predators like the wolf will no longer uh, be predatory on animals like lamb and sheep, and snakes won't bite people. Apparently, all animals are going to be tamed, and all carnivorous animals are going to be herbivores. I don't know if you've checked recently, but lions don't eat straw. You go to your local zoo, you will not find them feeding the lions bales of hay. They're feeding lions meat. You're not going to go to a farm where a bunch of sheep are there and see wolves hanging out. No, because wolves will eat sheep. So why aren't wolves no longer predators? Why are lions no longer herbivores as they're supposed to be in the millennium? I guess Jesus just, when he left, he just stopped them from doing that again. He turned them back into carnivores. Doesn't make any bloody sense, people. Come on, let's get it together. No. And that brings up the next thing. If Jesus ruled for 1,000 years, where is he? In case you haven't noticed, Jesus ain't here. At least I haven't seen him. There's no evidence that Jesus is here. He's not in Jerusalem. No, I've never been to Jerusalem. I haven't been to Israel, but I know people who have, and they've been to Jerusalem and no sign of Jesus there. He's not here in this world. Neither are the resurrected saints who have glorified bodies. Haven't seen any of them recently. They're supposed to be ruling all over the kingdom, which is the world. Don't see them. They're gone. So apparently, Jesus ruled for 1,000 years and he just said, peace out. Bye. No explanation. Where? So where's Jesus? Don't know. Why are animals no longer? Why are animals still carnivorous? No clue. Why aren't we living for hundreds of years like Isaiah said we would? No idea. All these things are supposed to be happening in millennium didn't happen. There is no evidence of it, not a shred. This 1,000 years would have been the greatest empire in the history of the world, and there is absolutely no evidence that it happened. Every other empire, there's evidence for it. The Egyptian Empire, for 3, 4 thousand years ago, there's evidence for the Egyptian Empire. We got pyramids, we got tons of evidence for the Egyptian Empire. There's evidence for the Assyrian Empire in archaeology. There's evidence for the Babylonian Empire. That lasted about 100 years. There's evidence for the Persian and Greek empires. And those each lasted a couple, by maybe 200, 300 years. And there's tons of archaeological evidence of those empires. The Roman Empire went for about 500 years, give or take, before it transformed into Catholicism. But the ancient Roman Empire, there is tons and tons and tons of evidence for it. I saw it myself personally when I was in Italy with my wife a few years ago. There is massive evidence of all of the Roman Empire, of the Greek Empire, of the Persian and Babylonian and Assyrian and Egyptian and you name the empire. Even in here in the U.S., there's evidence of the Aztec empires and the Mayan empires over here. There's evidence of the ancient Chinese empires. There's evidence of the ancient Japanese and Hindu and Indian empires. There's evidence for every empire in the world, but you're telling me there's zero evidence for the 1,000 year empire of Jesus, which is the longest and it would be most successful empire in the history of the world, and there's no evidence? Does that make any sense to you? The answer is no. It doesn't make any sense. Now, granted, there is some circumstantial evidence that people try to use to explain the millennial reign, and I'll get to it in a second, but I will tell you it is at best flimsy. There is no substantial evidence of this great empire, this great period of time, the greatest kingdom in the history of the world. No evidence for that. There's no evidence for all the other empires, but not this one. Does that make sense to you? No. You know why? Because it doesn't make sense. And lastly, you have the idea of the little season. If we are in the little season, two questions. Number one, who are we? Who are the people here? You and me. We're not the same as the people in the millennium, because we aren't living hundreds and hundreds of years. We only live about 70, 80 years if we're lucky. Where do we come from? Because we're not part of that part of the millennial reign. So who are we? Who knows? Don't know. No clue. And also, if remember, Satan has one job in the little season, to gather the nations together to surround Jerusalem, because that's where Jesus rules. As I said, Jesus is not in Jerusalem, so Satan has no incentive to surround Jerusalem. Jesus ain't there, and he's not doing it. He's not. Yes, Israel and Jerusalem are in turmoil. They have been since 1948, and when Israel became an empire. Excuse me, when Israel became a nation. But the the empire, the nations of the world aren't all marching to Israel. What's Satan doing? He ain't doing his job. He's not doing what the Bible said he would do. And again, the Bible says nothing about this. The Bible doesn't say Satan's just going to screw around for decades and many, many decades, which is what he'd have to be doing if this was true. It didn't say Jesus would disappear and take his saints with him at the end of the millennium, and that he would reverse everything that happened. None of that is biblical. It's not logical. It's not historical. No one remembers this. And the excuse that you hear from people is, well, history's been hidden from us. And I don't argue that some history's been hidden, sure, but all history? And how could they hide things from us when we have oral traditions and we have collective memory? Our grandfathers and grandmothers and our grandparents and their grandparents would have had some knowledge of this if it happened in any type of recency. Why don't we have any oral history of it? We don't. You know why? Because it didn't happen. The little season didn't happen. It's fraudulent. It's really bad, horrible theology. Oh, but let's keep going with it. So with this being such a horrible, aberrant theory, why does anyone believe it? What is the proof? And I did say there was some circumstantial evidence. And that circumstantial evidence is something known as Tartaria. Okay. What is Tartaria? Tartaria is the idea that in the recent past, and we're talking a couple hundred years ago, there was the end of a technologically advanced civilization, and they were called the Tartarians. Apparently, it originated in southern Russia, around Kazakhstan, the lower steppes of Russia, but it must have spread around the world because the so-called evidence is everywhere around the world, and the evidence is of these incredibly ornate buildings and architecture that was apparently created by a more advanced civilization. And I will grant you some of this architecture, and I'll have some of it on the screen here, are these beautiful buildings, amazing architecture that we don't really reproduce these days. I mean, if you look at it compared to the way we build things today, our buildings are shoddy and flimsy compared to some of these ancient buildings. And they had these huge domes on them, and they were acoustically sound to the degree that they'd be able to conduct sound and organ and music in a way that would reverberate and match the frequencies of our bodies, and cause us to be healed, and cause the people who existed during that time to be healed. They apparently had access to unlimited energy from the atmosphere, kind of like what you would hear about with Nikolai Tesla's um, experiments. They had unlimited energy. There were these antennas on top of these structures that would bring in the ambient energy from the atmosphere, and it would energize things and give us, the energy to do all the things we need to do instead of oil and gas and coal. That we had ambient energy. We had these healing places, and the people who occupied these buildings, they were apparently large. They were very, very tall, almost giants, 8, 9, 10, 12 feet tall, because you see these huge doors on them. So there was apparently a civilization that existed not too long ago, and these buildings and this architecture is the evidence of it. And there is a documentary which I recommend. It's very interesting. It's by a documentarian by the name of Sean Hibbler, Hibbler. It's called Old World Order, and it goes over all this fascinating stuff. And I will tell you, I do not have a clean explanation for it. So, but yeah, but go to Hitler's site if you're on the Roku platform and you're paying for Roku for Roku. I'm sorry, not Roku, excuse me, Rockfin. Sorry, not Roku, Rockfin. Forgive me. If you're on the Rockfin platform, and you have access to Rockfin, then you can go to Sean Hippler's site and you can download and watch his video on the Old World Order. It's really good. Well done. Hippler does a great job. He's a really good documentarian. So I recommend looking at it. And it's fascinating. I don't have a clean explanation for all of this, but I do know that even if these things are true, it doesn't mean that the millennium happened, because the people who believe in this little season, they use this whole Tartarian architecture as their proof point, saying that there was this advanced civilization and they had all this these advanced buildings and this advanced artwork, excuse me, architecture, and that is the culture. That's the society that was in the millennium, and that proves that the millennium happened because Jesus would have given us new technology, and these buildings are proof that that technology existed. And that's the main proof point that the little season people are using. This Tartarian architecture was supposedly the architecture and proof of the technology that existed during the millennium. And the fact that it's all abandoned and it's all gone and we can't reproduce it now shows that there was a civilization before us, not too long before us, just a few hundred years, that existed that was greater than us, and we are in a different situation now. Okay, but just because there's not a clean explanation for this so-called Tartarian architecture, that alone doesn't prove the millennium, even close. It doesn't prove that Jesus returned 1,000+ years ago. It doesn't explain what happened to all the devastation of the tribulation. It doesn't explain why animals aren't behaving today the way they were supposed to behave in the millennium. It doesn't explain why we're no longer living hundreds of years. It doesn't fit people just because you have this Tartarian architecture. And again, I don't have an explanation for it. I'm still looking for it. I'm still investigating it, but it doesn't prove the millennium. It's very, very flimsy evidence. You can't tie it. There are gaps in the Tartarian explanation. One of the big gaps is if apparently where's the Tartarian civilization? Where are these so-called giants? Apparently, they were wiped out in what's called a mud flood. And the reason for belief in this mud flood, and again, this is, to be fair, there's evidence there that a lot of these buildings, and I'll have it on the screen here, they were buried under the earth. A lot of them, half of them or more, are below ground, and it's again fascinating stuff. But there's nothing in the Bible about a mud flood. There's nothing in the Bible about any of this. So why should we believe that this matches biblical eschatology? We shouldn't. There is no reason to believe it. No matter what the explanation for Chitaria is, it doesn't fit. And the other reason that I don't know it doesn't fit is because we have what's called collective memory. We have the oral memory and history of our grandparents' grandparents. That's why I mentioned 150 years. Give you an example, if you can start with yourself. I was alive during 9/11, September 11th, 2001. I was alive. I was here on Earth. I saw it happen. I woke up on September 11th. I heard the news of what was happening with the Twin Towers. I go into my living room. I turn on the TV, and as I'm watching it, I see the second plane hit the second of the Twin Towers. About an hour or so later, I see those towers fall down. I saw that. That's in my memory. You cannot take that away from me. No matter what you try to do to hide history, I know what happened. I saw it. Now, I'm not getting into all the conspiracy theories around it. That's fine. I'm a conspiracy theorist myself. But no matter what the explanation is, the Twin Towers are gone. I saw them fall. I've been to New York since. I've seen the hole. I saw the hole in the ground where they once were. My two kids, my two boys, were not alive. So if they go into high school, which they will be in a few years, and someone writes a history book and they come home and say, "Hey, Dad, in this history book, we read that on September 11th, 2001, terrorists from Canada drove a Greyhound bus full of explosives into the Empire State Building and blew it up." I will tell them, no, boys, that's not what happened. Your dad was alive. I saw what it was. It wasn't the Empire State Building. It was the Twin Towers. They came down. You can't take that away from me. So, and my boys will have that. So no one can fool myself or my children about what happened on 9/11 because I saw it. And my grandchildren, if I live long enough to see them, I can tell them the same thing. This is what really happened. Don't believe any source of information that tells you differently because I have that memory. You have that memory. Going a little back further, my grandfather fought in World War II. I wasn't alive during World War II. That was a long time before I was born. But my grandfather was there. Shortly before my grandfather died, he and I were watching the movie Saving Private Ryan. Great movie. It was directed by Steven Spielberg. Well done, beautiful movie. We're watching it. In the early part of that movie, and some of the opening scenes, you have the invasion of Normandy on D-Day, and you see the main actors like Tom Cruise, not Tom Cruise, excuse me, Tom Hanks is in it, and so is Matt Damon and some other famous actors, Tom Sizemore. They invade Normandy, and there they are getting cut to pieces by the Germans who are entrenched on the beach. My grandfather looks at me and he says, "That's crap." Like, what do you mean, Grandpa? What do you mean that's crap? He says, "I was there. My unit were the first ones in, and my unit was all black." Well, he said Negro at the time. He said it was the first people on the beaches of Normandy were the Negroes. They sent the black people in first to get cut to pieces by the German artillery. Fortunately, my grandfather survived. He said, but after the blacks went in first, then they sent in the Irish because I guess they were next up on the totem pole of undesirables. Then after the Irish, they sent in the Italians and the Greeks. I'm sorry, the Italians and the Jews, maybe I guess the Greeks as well, but the Italians and the Jews went in next. Then after the blacks and the Irish and the Italians and the Jews went in, then they sent in like the Anglo-Saxon, the regular white people like Tom Hanks and Matt Damon. So those weren't, despite what Saving Private Ryan shows, the white people were not the first people on the beaches of Normandy, and I know that because my grandfather was there. So I know that Saving Private Ryan, those opening scenes were historically inaccurate because I have my grandfather's memories there, and I know my grandfather and I trust him. And my grandfather has his grandfather's memories, stories my grandfather's grandfather told him. My grandfather's grandfather was alive at the end of the Civil War and during early Reconstruction. So I have stories passed on from them. But anything beyond that, it gets a little fuzzy because you have like the telephone game. The more information passes down, it starts to get a little sketchy. But we all have 150 years of collective oral history going back to the mid 1800s or even more. For people who are older than me, people who are in their 80s and 90s, they have their grandparents information going back all the way then. And no one said anything about a mud flood, about any of the Tartarian stuff. There's no oral history of that. There's no oral history of Jesus being here and the millennium happening and lions and eating straw and wolves lying down with lambs. None of that. So at least we know that if this little season has happened, it's been at least 150 to 200 years, and because none of that stuff happened during the time when we have any collective memory of it. None of it happened. Tartaria, as far as I understand, didn't happen, at least the way the little season people are saying it happened. It was not part of the millennial reign of Christ. None of it happened. It's ridiculous, horrible, illogical, unhistorical, unbiblical stuff. So why in the world does anyone believe it? Because with it being such a easily disprovable theory. I didn't understand it. It puzzled me until I took a closer look and listened to what people were saying about it. And I noticed that everyone who talked about the little season seemed to have one thing in common. They would always mention the same thing. And once I heard this, I realized what was going on. Every time you look at someone or listen to someone who talks about the little season, you'll always hear them say this to justify it. That they'll say that Jesus promised his disciples that he would return during their lifetime. And that's how we know that the millennium and the return of Jesus and the millennium must have happened during the first century, which was the lifetime of the disciples. If you hear that and you're knowledgeable and you've been listening to Faith by Reason for any period of time, you know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about the preterists. The watchword, the watch phrase of preterists is that Jesus had to have returned during the lifetime of his disciples because he promised it. And this whole little season is just their latest way to try to justify their asinine, unbiblical eschatology. Who are preterists? I'll try to be brief with this. If you really want to take a deeper dive, I'll put a link into the show notes where I talk about preterism as why it's a completely bankrupt theology. But in short, preterists are people who believe that most of prophecy, 99% of prophecy, has already happened, that there's no more future prophecy. They believe that everything in the book of Revelation, from Revelation chapter 1 all the way up to Revelation chapter 20, has happened in the past. Tribulation, millennium, second coming, rapture, whatever, already happened. Why did they believe this? Their belief is based on one scripture. There is one scripture that every preterist uses to, they hang their hat on this scripture, and this is all they have to cling on to. Yes, they have a few supplemental scriptures here and there, but this is their main one. So the verse that preterists use to justify their belief is actually Matthew chapter 16, verse 28. And let me read it to you. It says, assuredly, or verily, verily, depending on your translation, I'm in the New King James. Assuredly, I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So Jesus is saying here in this verse that there are people who are standing there. He's talking to a group of his disciples. So he's saying a subset of you, a subset of his disciples, will live to see him coming in his kingdom. Now, the preterists interpret that to say that there are some disciples, certain disciples there in the first century who will be alive when Jesus returns in his kingdom. And they translate that as meaning, they translate the kingdom as meaning the second coming. So they say, and they will swear on this up and down, and they will get into fights with you about it, and they'll just shout you down, that this verse means that Jesus had to have returned in his second coming during the first century, if their interpretation is correct. If this interpretation is not correct, then preterism is wrong. Problem is, for preterists, they did misinterpret this verse. When Jesus says coming in his kingdom, he does not mean the second coming. How do I know that? Because I do something that preterists don't do. I actually read the original language. Whenever you're interpreting or trying to interpret the Bible, it's really important to consider one very, very clear and you would think obvious fact, and that is the Bible was not written in English. How do I know that? Because the English language didn't exist during the first century. There was maybe some Paleo-Gaelic, but the English language didn't exist. The Bible was not written in English. It was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. In this section, in this area, it was written in Greek. So that word in Greek for kingdom does not mean the kingdom of God's second coming. That word is basileia. Basileia does not mean a physical kingdom. In fact, I'm going to put it on the board now. I'm just cutting and pasting from the actual concordance that shows the Greek meanings. This is not my biases. This is just what the word means. And you will see it highlighted here. It does not mean a physical kingdom. It means appearing in the royal authority. So the true translation of this is that there will be a subset of the disciples who were talking to Jesus there, who Jesus was talking to, who will be alive to see, who will live to see Jesus appearing in his royal authority, not his kingdom. Because again, if you read Matthew 16 in context, it isn't even talking about the second coming. Jesus is talking about how to be a good Christian. He's talking about how to sacrifice. He's talking about, taking up your cross and following him. And he's saying that he's going to come with his reward, and that he's talking about his authority to give his reward. Jesus is talking about his authority at the end of Matthew chapter 16. So he's not talking about the second coming or the millennium. Why? And so the preterists try to put this. They try to insert the second coming here, but the second coming was not a part of what Jesus was talking about. And how do I know that this prophecy that Jesus said doesn't pertain to the events, to some future event? Because the preterists will tell you that when Jesus says that there are those who are standing here who will not see death till they see me coming in my kingdom, they say that Jesus had to return during the first century, during the lifetime of his disciples, which means that so if his second coming is in the first century, that means the tribulation, which precedes the second coming, has to be in the first century. Well, so they look at what happened in the first century that seems similar to the tribulation, and the closest thing they can come up with is the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now, it was a terrible period of time for Israel and Jerusalem. The 6 Roman legions led by General Titus Vespasian came down from Rome, and they destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed Israel. Tens of thousands of Jews were brutally killed, and the temple was completely destroyed, just leveled to the ground. Jerusalem was absolutely razed. But there's a lot more going on in the tribulation than just the destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, the destruction of Jerusalem isn't even a part of the tribulation. None of the things of the tribulation actually happened in 70 AD. No hailstones, no rivers and waters turning to blood, no bowls of wrath, no 7 trumpets, no Antichrist setting himself up in the temple. The temple was destroyed. No mark of the beast, no false prophet. None of the things that happened in the book of Revelation that outline the tribulation happened in 70 AD. When you confront a preterist with this, we'll say, well, Jesus, that's not what he really meant. When he talks about earthquakes, he means like, a shaking in the spiritual realm. Okay. When he talks about the rivers and oceans turning to blood, well, what he really means is that it's going to be a bloody time. All right. What about the armies of locusts and the armies of demonic horsemen? Well, they're really talking about the Roman armies. Okay, so you have to allegorize the hell out of Revelation in order for preterism to be true. Basically, they are trying to contort the Bible to fit their theology, and you should never do that. That's one of the hallmarks of faith by reason. I say this all the time. Do not change the Bible to fit your doctrine. Change your doctrine to fit the Bible. Stop trying to contort the Bible to make it fit into what you believe. Change what you believe to fit into the Bible. Preterists do the opposite. Preterists want to take the Bible and history and logic and twist it and turn it in order to fit into their theology. Don't do that. That is poor, poor hermeneutics. And the other reason it's poor hermeneutics is because what Jesus said about people living to see him appearing in his royal authority doesn't happen in 70 AD. It doesn't, don't have to wait 40 years. You just have to wait 6 days and just turn the page. Turn to the next chapter, because Matthew 16, 28 is the last verse in chapter 16. And keep in mind that the verses and chapter breaks are man-made. They weren't in the original script. All you got to do is keep reading the original scripture, excuse me. Just keep reading. If you just keep reading to what we call chapter 17, it says clearly that 6 days later, 6 days after saying that some people will live to see him appearing in his royal glory, 6 days later, Jesus takes a group of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, a subset of the previous disciples, and he is transfigured before him. His face shines like the sun. He appears in his royal glory. He appears in his royal authority. Jesus says, there are some of you who are standing here who will live to see me appear in my royal glory. 6 days later, some of the people standing there see him appearing in his royal glory. Prophecy fulfilled. Not in 70 AD, not at any other point in the future. It happens right then and there, and that completely destroys preterism. And instead of just understanding that and accepting it, preterists who are in their pride say, nope, we're right. It has to be the second coming happening in the 1st century. It's not what's happening, folks. That's not what's going on. Even though preterists are a small but very vocal group, and they refuse to accept what's right in front of them. They refuse to accept what the Bible actually says, because in their mind, their doctrine is more important than the Bible, because they have to change the Bible to make it true. And this whole little season thing is just the latest way they're using to justify themselves. Their theory is bankrupt. It has no historical, biblical foundation whatsoever. But instead of accepting that, they try to latch on to anything new. And once this whole Tartarian thing started to be, started to blow up in the whole conspiracy world, which it did a few years ago, preterists were like, oh, hey, we can use this to try to wedge it into our doctrine of Jesus having returned 1,000 years ago. Even though, by the way, it's been over 2,000 years since Jesus was here, and it's since 70 AD. So if Jesus returned in 70 AD, then the millennium should have been over around the year 1070, which is 1,000 years ago. So apparently this little season of Satan has been going on for 1,000+ years, because again, the year 1070 was a long time ago. How do they justify this? Well, again, they just start contorting history. Well, history's been hidden. There's a missing 1,000 years. How do you know it's a missing 1,000 years? Well, because in order for us to be right, the 1,000 years we have to have a missing 1,000 years. That's what they do all the time. They just change anything to fit their beliefs. For example, the book of Revelation, all legitimate scholars will tell you that the book of Revelation, written by the Apostle John, was written in 95 AD, and it was written in the future tense. However, according to preterists, the Revelation has to have been written before 70 AD. So that brings up the classic meme. In order for preterism to be true, the book of Revelation had to be written before 70 AD. Therefore, the book of Revelation was written before 70 AD, because if it was written after 70 AD, preterism wouldn't be true. And that's impossible. Preterism has to be true. So let's just change everything around in order to fit our doctrine. They're changing the Bible, they're changing history, they're changing logic and reason in order to fit their ridiculous, asinine, horrible theory. And that's where we are. That's what the little season is all about. It's third wave preterism. The first wave is full preterism. The second wave is partial preterist. Some people who know that a lot of preterism is stupid, but they want to cling on to a little bit of it, so they're partial preterists. And now you have the third wave, the little season people. The little season is just third wave preterism, but it's just as bad as the first two. It's illogical, it's unbiblical, it's unhistorical. There is zero evidence of any of this. So don't believe it, because it's dangerous. Why is it dangerous? And I'll end with this, because I told you that. I would tell you why it's dangerous in the beginning. It is dangerous because there's a possibility you're going to miss out on some things that you need to be aware of in the end times. For example, Jesus commands us to be watchful for his coming. In the rapture is what I believe he's talking about here. In the letter to the church at Sardis, he tells them to be watchful. If you are not watchful, I will come upon you as a thief. What does a thief do? A thief comes to take something that belongs to you that you don't want them to take. In this case, I believe it is your position in the rapture. I could be wrong. And maybe you're going to be raptured if you're a Christian, whether you're watchful or not. Maybe, and hopefully that'll be great if that works out that way. But I don't believe that Jesus would tell you to be watchful if there wasn't a reason for you to be watchful. However, if you believe in the little season, then you are not watchful for the rapture, or even the second coming, or even the tribulation. You are not watching for anything except for Satan to gather people together to come against Jerusalem, because you believe that all these things, the rapture, the tribulation, the second coming, have already happened. So you're not watching out for them. And lastly, that term little season, the Apostle John, who penned the book of Revelation, uses that word in that same phrase in Revelation chapter 6, verse 11, where it says, where God is telling the martyrs to wait for a little season until all the other martyrs have been martyred, and that's only 7 years. So why would he use the word little season to mean about 7 years in this case, and then use that exact same phrase, Mikaios, which means micro, where we get the term micro? A micro season is 7 years in Revelation chapter 6, but now it's supposed to be a couple hundred years in Revelation chapter 20? No. Little season means a short period of time, not hundreds of years, not decades, just a few years at most. Little season makes no sense. Stop believing it. Don't be deceived. All right, that's enough. I've been pounding this into the ground. You should get it by now. If you're not, well, let me know in the comments, and I'll try to go over it with you. I'll try to explain it to you a little more carefully. Let's wrap this up. It's been a while. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. Please subscribe to Faith by Reason on YouTube or on Rumble, wherever you're seeing this. Subscribe on faithbyreason.net by putting your information to the right navigation bar, putting your email in there. That way you will get notified when new information goes up and when I'm doing the live streams and the little videos that I plan on doing. So again, thank you very much. Please don't be deceived. Please use discernment. You're going to hear a lot of crazy stuff in the next several months and weeks and years, depending on how much time we have left, as things continue to accelerate. Always use discernment. If you have questions, let me know. If you want me to do a video on some other aberrant, crazy theories you're hearing, I'll research it and I'll do it for you because I want you to be informed. And I don't want you to be fooled by these people who are trying to deceive you. Right. Thanks again, and I will talk to you very soon.